speaker is Kerstin, telling us on who needs to tell the truth, and also needs to tell the truth. So, yeah, I can take it away. She's muted.
Hi, Kerstin. I think you can hear me. Like, can everyone else hear us on this side?
You don't suppose that I heard with this sound? Is it better?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Sorry, I had some
you can take it
connection problems here as well. Should I just start and yes. I'll share screen again? Okay, let's see. Okay. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present here. And what I want to talk about today are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And so here you see it as for Indigenous people, because those are the main examples that I had in mind when I was writing the paper. But really what it is about is a certain setup of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, whether it is for Indigenous people or any other kind of minority that has experienced historic injustice and is positioned in what I refer to as a non-transitional society. So a society in which the institutional structures and power structures have not changed since the time of that injustice. You will see that I'm focusing on two examples, the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Canadian one. So this is what I'm mainly talking about, but as I said, I would expect or I would hope that what I'm saying is in a certain way generalizable to other smaller contexts in other countries. And that was also part of the motivation for that paper, which is that especially in a lot of Scandinavian countries nowadays, Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Indigenous population there, which are mainly Sami, but in Norway it's also they are popping up all over. So Greenland already had a commission, which is Scandinavian in the sense that it belongs to Denmark. Sweden is establishing one, Finland has one running right at the moment, the Norwegian one is ongoing as well. What I want to talk about, now I have to see how to, I'm sorry, there's, okay, I'm sorry. So I'll just continue to speak and try to get it running. What I want to talk about are three things. So first, the setup of the commissions and what that means for them as a means to combat injustice. And then secondly, what kind of problems we might encounter, because they might also be seen as signs of epistemic exploitation. And in the last part, I want to say a few words about what could possibly be done to decrease the risk of epistemic exploitation when there are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in non-transitional societies. So I guess at least for the South African audience, this is something you are very well aware of, but so I'm using here Heiner's definition of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a temporary official bodies that are set up to investigate and report on a pattern of human rights abuses in the past by engaging directly with the affected population. And so you can see that both in the Canadian and in the Norwegian case, basically all of these criteria can be checked. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up by the government or through a government mandate for a set amount of years, and they had the mandate to investigate and report on human rights abuses that were firmly in the past. So in the case of Canada, it was residential schooling, which officially ended in 1996. And in the case of Norway, it's the so-called Norwegianization policy, which also ended in the late 1950s in Norway, is officially. So they have a focus on past injustice, and they engage directly with the affected population insofar as they are very victim-centered in both cases. So they were hearing testimonies of residential school survivors and their families in Canada, and in Norway now they are looking for Sami and Kwen who are willing to testify about the experiences they had and the effect of Norwegianization policies on them. And Norwegianization policies, broadly speaking, are kind of the umbrella term that is used in Norway for all kinds of assimilation policies that the Sami have been subject to, for example, prohibition of speaking the language and things like that. So let's look shortly at the mandates. So the Norwegian TRC has three main goals. So they should perform a historical survey to map the Norwegian authorities' policy and activities toward the Sami and Kwen, so that are the Norwegian Finnish minority there. They are to carry out and investigate the effects of the Norwegianization policy and should consider how this policy has affected the majority population and their attitude to the Sami and Kwen. And they should also investigate the consequences of Norwegianization up until the present day. And lastly, they are to propose measures to contribute to further reconciliation. And in the Canadian TRC's mandate, we can see very similar goals. So here it says, the Commission shall acknowledge the residential school experience, impact and consequences. It should promote awareness and public education of Canadians about the residential school system and its impacts. It should create a complete historical record about it and should produce and submit a report including recommendations to the Government of Canada. So we can see that it's very similar goals and objectives that both of the TRCs have. And what I want to highlight here is their connection to epistemic injustice and both hermeneutical and testimonial injustice here. But first, or before I'm doing that, maybe it's important to place the need for such TRCs and for them to accomplish these goals in the context of willful ignorance. So this is something that Gail Polhaus, but also Charles Mills and Nancy Trana have talked about, and they've defined it as actively obscuring and avoiding knowledge that would undermine one's own privilege. And so it's important to keep in mind that the majority population in both countries in a certain way is willfully ignorant about these past injustices that are the object of the TRC. So in Canada, for example, before the TRC, it was less than 50% of Canadians that actually knew about residential schools, both in the sense of what they are and what has taken place there. And in Norway, I don't have numbers, but the general public is not very knowledgeable, both about Sami culture and history in general, and especially about this period in which the Norwegianization policy, which was more than 100 years, has taken place. And so the willfully, or what makes something willfully ignorant is that one avoids this knowledge in order to protect privileges. And so here I think it's also important to keep in mind that by not knowing about these past injustices, the majority population in these countries does protect their privileges in the sense that they can keep a positive self-image. And this also means a positive self-image of the collective, especially, for example, in such a colonial state, where it allows them to obscure kind of the violence that has taken place in building up the countries as they are today, but also by escaping responsibility for enduring injustice, by having to recognize that there are these injustices from the past that still have effects today, and that because they are built on injustices in the past committed by the state and the majority, there might be kind of extra responsibilities to address and rectify these enduring injustices. So if we see TRCs in that context, I think it becomes clear that they can be used as tools to counter willful ignorance and also counter epistemic injustice in the sense of testimonial and hermeneutical injustice, which kind of enables people to stay willfully ignorant. So I'm here basing myself on Miranda Fricker, as probably most of us do, who has defined as testimonial injustice as downgrading someone in their capacity as a knower. So we can see that, for example, if Indigenous people are painted as not reliable, or if testimonies, for example, of residential school survivors are decried as just singular cases in which children have had these experiences and not representative for the whole, or where certain traumas are seen more as an emotional pathology of whoever is talking about it, rather than as a very normal and justified response to the experiences that these people had. So these are all signs of testimonial injustice in that context. And hermeneutical injustice, Fricker says, means to obscure from someone part of their lived experience through a lack of concepts. And so here I think it's very important that it's not necessarily, I think it's not always the case, so it sometimes applies, especially when we talk about, for example, children from Indigenous groups that have been taken out of these groups and given up for, or not given up, but have been given to non-Indigenous families in adoptions, that they might lack concepts because they, to describe their experience, because they are not part of the vocabulary and hermeneutical resources of the majority. But I think what would also fall under that is that very often we have the case that in the minority communities, they do have concepts and the words to make sense of their own experience, but they are not in the public vocabulary. So it's very hard for them to communicate these experiences to the majority. And so I think here TRCs come in and in a certain way start to kind of undermine epistemic injustice, because they unsilence the topic of past injustice. They acknowledge the legitimacy of the knowledges and experiences of victims, especially because they are official bodies set up by the government. And so the testimonies become knowledge that is officially sanctioned, and thereby is made part of the public cognitive scene. And this also means that, for example, concepts that only have been used in those minority groups before now are brought into the public or in the majority discourse, and thereby both testimonial and hermeneutical injustice are lessened. So we can say TRCs establish victims as knowers and gives them a voice, and I think this is very important to keep in mind when I'm now going to the second more critical part of the talk, which is mainly focused on problems of TRCs. But I think it's still important to keep in mind that they also can and probably will, or hopefully will have, these positive effects in combating epistemic injustice. But one of the problems I see with TRCs in these settings is that they are not just combating epistemic injustice, but they are also in a certain way committing another epistemic injustice, namely epistemic exploitation. So Nora Berenstein defines epistemic exploitation as something that occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to educate them about the nature of their oppression. And so I think here we can, or I will go in into a little bit more detail later on why I think TRCs for Indigenous people fall under this. But before doing so, I want to draw a little bit of attention to what it means also to testify for a lot of former victims that decide to take part in a TRC. So some of the burdens associated with testifying usually is that it's very emotionally challenging. So a lot of people have to relive their trauma. They become publicly vulnerable by exposing their experiences. They expose what is private, and often this doesn't only mean what is private for them, but also it involves their family or their community. It also requires a lot of time and effort to go to the meetings, to testify, to prepare what one wants to say and how one wants to say this. So it's quite a challenging process. And so then one could say, okay, but for example, especially in Canada, where the setting up of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was one of the demands of residential school survivors when they were in a settlement process with the Canadian government about residential schools. So if it is them if it's minority groups who want a TRC, and if it helps them to combat epistemic injustice regarding their group, then why is it epistemic exploitation? Why are they compelled to educate the majority? And so here I'm relying on a definition by David Miller about exploitation, which I found brings out the three main characteristics of exploitation that are of importance here. So he says, so the first characteristic of exploitation is that the exploiter can choose another less exploiting course of action. So I think here, when we think about TRCs, is that the only way to combat epistemic injustice? No, it's not. There is enough information, and there have been enough possibilities for the government, for example, to educate the majority about what has happened, which would have probably also helped with combating some of the epistemic injustice Indigenous peoples are subject to at the moment. So it's not necessarily that the TRC is the only way to do so, and it could have happened much earlier, because as I said in the beginning, these are all policies that have ended decades ago, at least officially ended decades ago. So, and only now there are TRCs. Then the second characteristic Miller talks about is that he says the exploiter benefits more than they would in a just benchmark situation. So here the point is not that the exploiter benefits more in total than the exploited, right? So, but that we need to ask what would be a just benchmark situation. And I think here the just benchmark situation again would be a situation in which the government and also the majority would acknowledge what has happened openly, would share the information. Basically, they would give up their willful ignorance. But what's happening now in comparison is that the ones who are the exploiters, so in a certain sense the majority, they do not need to seek or provide information on their own of what has happened. They can just consume what is offered to them by the testimonies. On top of that, they can even feel good about having offered a TRC, and so showing that they are now better. It's all in the past, the injustices that happened, without acknowledging that a TRC is first and foremost is only necessary because of the all of the ignorance for all the years beforehand. And they also spared the shame and time and the emotional investment, which I have talked about, that the victims have to undergo of testifying because they are not actively involved in the procedures. And so, and the last characteristic of exploitation that I want to look here is at it, that the exploited is in comparatively greater need of something than the exploiter. And in the next slide, I will talk about how that creates a double bind for victims, because here, basically, we see that if we see the minority or the indigenous people here as exploited, their need is comparatively greater because for them, enduring epistemic injustice and being faced with willful ignorance of the majority has very tangible consequences in terms of discrimination, of not receiving enough funding for addressing some of the enduring injustices, etc., etc. Whereas the exploited, so the majority population, doesn't really gain anything much from educating themselves. And so I think this, in a certain sense, creates a double bind for a lot of participants or potential participants in TRCs, because now they need to decide whether they want to participate in a TRC to potentially break through willful ignorance and then thereby better the situation of their groups, but also accept being epistemically exploited and bearing all the burdens that I have described that come with testifying, or they refuse the participation. But then they might also have to accept the status quo, or at least slower change, because if there are less people testifying, they might fear that this makes the TRC less powerful or has less reach and things like that. So I think this is kind of the main problem with TRCs, to create this double bind, and the whole paper has come out actually of conversations with people in Canada that have described exactly this double bind, and who were quite angry and saying, you know, some of them were saying, I have testified, or others have said, no, I have not testified because it would have been too challenging, too traumatic for myself, but I feel really guilty about not having done that. And that doesn't mean that everyone who has testified did not want to testify. I think there are a lot of some kind of closure, or very empowering to be given that that possibility. But there's also the subgroup that feels like they are facing this dilemma. And so in the last few minutes of the talk, I want to have a short look at what might be ways of kind of lessening the double bind, so of breaking a TRC where those people who want to testify can use it as a public forum that is officially sanctioned, that gives them voice, etc., but without exerting pressure on those who do not want to testify to do so, because they do not have to fear that this is their only way of addressing the injustices that they're currently experiencing. So I think the first and most important point is that there needs to be broad education about Indigenous issues aside from TRCs, and at the same time as TRCs. So what we have happening now is that Indigenous history and knowledge is addressed in the curriculum more, there are memorial days, there might be also politicians and public figures highlighting the past injustices in their lives. But this is kind of an outcome of the recommendations of the TRC. So this kind of has been made conditional on the findings of the TRC, thereby actually increasing this pressure that might have been felt by some people to testify and to participate in the TRC. So what I think is that it's really important to start these things at the same time as TRC, so that people are seeing that these issues are addressed no matter whether they testify or not. And usually there already is enough knowledge about these things that we do not depend on a lot of individual testimonies for quite a few, for already establishing quite a few facts about it. And I think what is a bit more critical, or what is a bit more ambiguous, is the more active involvement of perpetrators, especially in non-transitional societies where there are no incentives for perpetrators to actually admit what they have done, and where they can maybe not be effectively compelled to participate in a constructive manner. So I think someone who has been a teacher in a residential school, for example, coming before TRC, I'm saying, well, but everything in my school was great. I don't know what people are complaining about. That doesn't help anyone, and that's actually more counterproductive. But we shouldn't forget that institutions are also perpetrators, and here it's also about structural injustices. And so we don't necessarily always need individuals to come and testify, but we should hold institutions accountable to provide, for example, documents about this period. And this is something that in the Canadian TRC was listed in the report as one of the main hindrances of their work, that the federal government and the churches did not open their archives and did not give access to the relevant documents. And so I think here this is another point of relieving affected individuals of the pressure testify if they do not want to, if they know that the information they're providing can also be gained otherwise through, for example, documents or institutions, whereas if they know or if they experience that these documents are kept locked, then the pressure will exponentially increase for them, because now they are the only source of getting to light what has happened. And lastly, I think it's also important really to keep in mind that part of the pressure is about epistemic injustice and hermeneutical and testimonial injustices and breaking through willful ignorance, but there are also other enduring injustices that are very material, where it's about underfunding of certain services, the need for increased funding for culture-specific mental health services was mentioned again and again in the Canadian case, for example, and that a lot of the pressure for people to testify in order to make the case that more funding is needed and that it is justified and that it is connected to the past injustice will be decreased if, for example, the government already uses the discretion they have in funding allocation to alleviate these material needs of the groups in question. So very shortly, these are the sources, but if anyone of you wants the sources, please also feel free to just contact me. Thanks very much.